Welcome to the lore tours of Invictus 2952. This is where I walk the floor and tell you about the history of the ships and their creators. So join me on the floor for your tour. Welcome to the Anvil floor here at Invictus 2952. My name is Paul Shelley. I am your host, your Lord of Lore for this evening. This is a lore tour where I'm going to walk you across the floor and tell you about the lore of the various ships. So, as I've been saying, I cannot do this without your support. Thank you so much to all of those of you who've been following me, following the Galactic Historian, all of the benefits, all of the good things that have been happening. Thank you so much for all of that support. It really does mean a lot. If you want to join these folks in helping me make these sorts of videos, make sure you hit the like button and comment down below to let me know how much you enjoy this, what ships are your favorites, and, subscribe so you can see these ones coming out when they come out, as soon as they come out. I plan on doing one for each one of the floors for Invictus. I do this for Invictus and for IAE, so if you like this kind of stuff, make sure you follow us along and subscribe there as well. Without further ado, let's get started with the history of Anvil Aerospace. Now, it's important to note that Anvil Aerospace is not the first iteration of Anvil Aerospace. It began as Case Aerospace in the early 2600s, around 2599 actually is when it was founded. And Leonard Case was its founder, who was an RSI engineer. He grew displeased with the red tape and bureaucracy of Robert Space Industries, and wanted to found his own company. So he did, and he produced a civilian vessel called the Cosmos Sloop, and it was pretty well received. But when it was released, was 2606 or 2604. And shortly after that, the beginnings of the Second Tavaran War happened. And the Second Tavaran War meant that there needed to be new ships to produce to counter the new Tavaran threat, which Case stepped up and built the Hurricane. We'll talk about that here in a moment. But it was so well received by the Navy that the second Ivor Mezzer's son, actually wanted to bring Case in and build new vessels for the military, especially aging vessels, replacing aging vessels, which Leonard Case was very much open for. But he died sadly in 2615, and shortly after that, all of the military contracts that they had managed to acquire were quietly pulled from them. Eventually, they went defunct in 2623. A lot of their designs being taken or sold to other various firms that just hold on to. Then in the 2700s, let's see the actual date. In 2772, a man by the name of J. Harris Arnold found the designs of Leonard Case and was inspired by them. And so he set about to bring back the legacy of Case Aerospace with a new generation of ships, beginning with the Terrapin. Now, that didn't go so well with the Mezzers at the time, but shortly after the creation of Anvil Aerospace, the Mezzers were no longer around. The anti-Mezzer revolution happened, and the Mezzers were overthrown. And the new UEE wanted to distance itself from Aegis, which had been so closely aligned with the Mezzers. So they looked to new manufacturers, specifically Anvil, to help fill in the roles that Aegis's aging designs were filling. So ever since then, Anvil has become very slowly but surely the replacement for Aegis for the new UEE, with pretty much every type of vessel that exists, save for capital ships that we have so far, being made by Anvil Aerospace. With that being said, that just a kind of quick and dirty history of Anvil, let's look at some of their ships, starting with the Arrow. Now, the Arrow is interesting. It's unique because the Arrow has the least amount of lore, but a lot of its design can tell us what's going on. We know that right around this time, 2950s, the UEE is retiring its Gladius fleet, which has been around for hundreds of years. They've been updated over time, but the Gladius is no longer really a ship being used by the UEE Navy. So instead, they still need new light fighters, but they don't want to use the Gladius. So as a result, a kind of surge of interest have come in with light fighters as Gladiuses have been sold to the civilian market, and many civilians like them. This has caused copycats with things like the Drake Buccaneer, which is a direct response to the Gladius, especially in the civilian market, and the Anvil Aero, which is designed, again, to replace the Gladius. We don't have a full, that isn't written down in lore, but doesn't take too long to figure out that this is designed to replace the Gladius. The big thing here is the wings. These are foldable wings. The only reason why you have these wings fold like this is to fit in a smaller area. It's not that big anyways, even with the wings extended. The reason why you fold wings like this is because of carrier operations. So this is designed specifically to work as a carrier ship. And not many civilian carriers out there. So this is definitely designed for the UEE Navy to use in the future. But it is one of many different ships. Especially, it's a unique design for Anvil because Anvil's design philosophy has always been armor and weapons, usually not speed and maneuverability. So the Aero, being faster and a little bit more maneuverable than your typical Anvil ship, has made it fairly popular and a very weird kind of niche. And it can illustrate the beginnings of, not beginnings of, but the form language of Anvil. And I'll explain here. This is the Anvil Aerospace logo. Notice that it has a point and a circle with a little tail. Well, let's take a look at the design language of the Aero. Notice at the very center is a circle. There's a circle right there where the turret is. And it comes to a point and falls back into a point as well as kind of a little wing shape out on the sides, little wings on the sides. This is on every single Anvil ship. It's on the Carrack, it's on the Pisces, it's on the Hawk, it's on every single ship. It's more exaggerated in other ways, in some ways than others, but the Aero is a great example of that sort of design style. Especially the big singular center circle, which is important to it, which was also hallmarks of Case Aerospace. All right, with that, let's move on to the next ship, which is actually the result of a scam. You see, in the late 29th century, the UEE was still dealing with the Van Duel. And one of the best ways to deal with the Van Duel is torpedoes. They're very effective against the Van Duel. But the Van Duel know this, so they shoot them down quite frequently. So they needed something that could slip by the sensors of the Van Duel. Something that they didn't know it was hitting them. And some civilians, a civilian group, came forward and said that they had developed what they had determined they called a stealth torpedo, one that was invisible to sensors. And the UEE Navy was very interested in this. The problem was that the design of the stealth torpedo required that the bomber who fired it stick around and effectively laze the target from a close distance. So it needed to be tough, it needed to be small to fit on carriers, and it needed to have some protection, hence the turret there. This became the Gladiator. Now, the Gladiator was designed specifically to fire this torpedo and this torpedo alone. It was designed to be the delivery vehicle for the stealth torpedo. So they turned to Anvil, gave them a no-bid contract, allowed them to build this ship, and they built it out of Hornet parts. The Hornet program had been in full swing by this point, so they tried to use as much parts as they could from the Hornets, including, you can see the cockpit is very similar, the glass is very similar, a lot of the components are very similar. These were all very similar to the Hornet. Use these things to reduce the cost a little bit. After this had all been done, the first Hornet or the first Gladiators were rolling off the lines. The UE was delivered their first stealth torpedo and found out it was just a size 9 torpedo with off-the-shelf electronic components just kind of hot glued to it. They had been scammed. They've been given a ride, and which was, embarrassing, but it was even worse because they had an entire contract for these babies, and they didn't know what to do with them. So, thinking quickly, the Navy decided that they were going to announce this as a replacement for an aging carrier bomber made by Aegis, and tout it as a self-defending bomber, that turret on the back would be able to protect it, so it did not need fighter cover to protect it. That didn't work. It definitely needed fighter cover. It wasn't as effective as they hoped. But it has been used to great effectiveness by Squadron 214, or aka the Black Crows, who use these for various different roles, including search and rescue, observations, and obviously bombing runs. With this torpedo section here being able to open up and be swapped out for different components, different parts. So while it got a little bit of a early misstep, it eventually got to its feet and is still fairly well used by the UE today. One disaster to another, though, let's talk about the Carrack. Now, the Carrack was developed in the early 29th century. Look at my notes here to get exactly. It was first created in 2822. So the original reason for it was that there was a bad habit that the Navy had, where they would use large capital ships to do exploration missions. And they sent one large capital ship out to do an exploration mission, and it was lost with all hands. And the decision to do so, while the crew wasn't prepared for it, nor were they trained for it, kind of put the whole debacle, the fault falling onto the Admiralty, to the leaders of the Navy who had sent them there in the first place. And there had always been a discussion on, did the Navy need dedicated exploration ships? They're the Navy. They defend and they attack. They don't necessarily need to do science. So this whole thing kind of put that to a bed, and they said, we need a dedicated exploration and science vessel or survey vessel. So they contacted Anvil, gave them a no-bid contract. You notice a theme here. They like to give Anvil all the top-secret hush-hush projects. And they built the Carrack. Now, there's a little bit of new lore here, which comes from here. Professor Sasha Lee was involved in creating what was called the custom spectrum ISO matrix, more sensitive than anything else in terms of its sensors. So this allowed these ships to be able to see further and more clearer than any other ship out there. The Carrack was so secret that it just showed up onto the flight line in the Killian system in MacArthur. And many civilian observers began to see it and didn't know what it was. At first, they thought it was possibly a bomber or some sort of top-secret E-war ship. And eventually, it was revealed that it was an exploration ship. And from the get-go at that point, many explorers were very interested. A military-grade exploration ship from Anvil, they were on board right away. So the Carrack, the UES Carrack, the first Carrack built, was sent out to explore the Oort cloud, which is the farthest reaches of a system of the Killian system, which is 195 AU. Very, very far away. It didn't have a lot of scans as it was in the first place, so they had to be very careful. And this is the first ship and the only ship to ever have made it that far in that system. It did scans and came back, because one of the concerns that the Navy had was the system was so big and so unmapped in its outer edges that there could be entire civilizations out there in the distance that they didn't see, including specifically jump points. And last thing the Navy wanted was a backdoor to their headquarters that maybe the Vanduul had. So they continued to use the Carracks for various different purposes, survey and exploration and science. And while the civilians requested, hey, can we get a civilian Carrack? Anvil asked the UE, because one of the things that is very well known for Anvil is that they use they often develop their civilian models of their military ships alongside the military ships themselves. So when that was requested, usually the military says, yeah, it's fine. We'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the Hornet. But in this case, the military said no, because they had covered up the accident that was the impetus to start the Carrack in the first place. And by allowing them to produce the Carrack to civilian models, for civilian models, that information would have been let out to the public. So the Carrack holds the distinction as the ship that took the longest to get a civilian variant. Eventually, it was produced in the 2920s, after those people in charge had been exposed for their own cover-ups and been removed from power. Then Anvil was allowed to produce civilian Carracks, which they have done fairly recently too. Took some time though. Took I think 5 to 10 years for them to actually develop the Carracks, because the so much integrated military technology was part of it that they had to swap out for civilian stuff. And of course, the Pisces right here is a bespoke ship. It was designed alongside the Carrack to be worked as the Carrack's kind of tender and a mini exploration ship to extend its range a little bit further. That's the Carrack. Now we're going to talk about Project Brawler. Now, Project Brawler is the project that specifically was designed for, well, it was the project where the Hawk was kind of birthed from. Its specific goal was, and I'm going to read this, close-range dogfighting, logistic support, and ground attack missions. That was its purpose. The purpose of Project Brawler was to take those three things and mush them together into one single-seat fighter. And that was difficult to do. Those things don't usually go well together. So Anvil produced the Hawk. Drake produced effectively the Cutlass again, after they'd already tried to do it again. And Aegis produced a brand new ship called the Bearcat. Drake was disqualified almost instantly because it was just a Cutlass. And so Aegis and Anvil were the ones who remained. Now, for all records, the Bearcat was the better ship. It was a good fighter. It was a much better ship than the Hawk. However, it didn't do what they wanted it to. It did well in dogfighting, but not so much ground attack. It definitely struggled in ground attack. So the Hawk would eventually become the winner. Also, another reason why the Hawk would become the winner was because it is basically a Hornet kit bash. Much of this technology is just stuff taken from the Hornet. Something like 80 to 90% of all of the parts on this thing are just Hornet parts. So it was cheap to fix and cheap to manufacture. So it's cheap. It does what it says on the tin, nothing else, but it does what it says on the tin. And it's, that's it. It was better than the competition. So the Hawk, just as I was saying earlier, it got a lot of attention early on from bounty hunters. So while it was being produced for the military, it was also a civilian variant was built for bounty hunters. Now, the Hawk was very good at its role: ground attack, close-range dogfighting, and logistics support. All of those things it did so well that pirates, when they saw the Hawk, would just stop making bases on planets, and they would not get into close-range dogfighting. Effectively just making the Hawk useless, because when it showed up, they just wouldn't do the things that they knew the Hawk was good at and knew that the Hawk would struggle at anything else. So in some ways, it did its job. It prevented those things from happening. In other ways, because it wasn't flexible, it really doesn't work for anything else. There are still some Hawks in service, but they're relatively niche and only like one squadron of them exists in the lore right now. But there are plenty of them in the civilian market. So the civilian, especially the bounty hunters, began to use them quite extensively. And there are, in fact, two different variants, which we haven't seen: the Shadow Hawk and the Dire Hawk. The Shadow Hawk was designed as a kind of a stealth variant. It's an aftermarket kit to turn the Hawk into a more stealthy variant. And the Dire Hawk just adds more guns to the thing. The Shadow Hawk has been kind of talked about possibly becoming a actual official variant, but it's kind of less likely, but the Direhawk has been discussed as a official variant by Anvil. So we may be able to see a Super Hawk, a version of the Hawk in the near future. Now we go to the granddaddy of all Anvil ships. Not the oldest Anvil ship, but the first Anvil ship. And I'll explain that here later. This is the Terrapin. Now, as I was saying, at the end of the Meser era, the UEE needed new manufacturers to fill the role of Aegis. And one of the big things that the Navy changed over this time was, up to this point, the Navy's focus had always been the Xi'an, conflict with the Xi'an. So their ships, their doctrine was all focused on that, especially along the Peri line. But now that the Xi'an and humanity were at peace, and the detente of the Cold War was happening, as everything was kind of calming down, the Navy needed to fill new roles. They needed specifically small ships, a small ship that was able to be launched from carriers, the Idris being the smallest carrier, that could go long distances, could jump through jump points, could remain mostly hidden, but have powerful sensors and survive long ways on its own before coming back, especially dealing with things like the Vanduul. This thing basically needed to detect the Vanduul invasion before it hit system. So the engineers at Anvil came up with the Terrapin. The Terrapin is actually, technically, a stealth ship. Now, why is it a stealth ship? Well, its armor is so thick that it doesn't radiate heat. Its IR signature is much lower. EM signature is much higher, but IR signature is much lower than a typical ship. And in fact, it's so bad that it can overheat and cook itself to death and its crew to death. So they had to install these wings that are effectively coolers. They open up to let the heat radiate out a little bit more and help prevent overheating of the ship while it's in operation. But it's a tough, mean little ship, and it did its job well. Now, it wasn't the first ship to get a civilian variant, but right after its release, new veterans returning from conflict after they'd used the Terrapin began to buy the Terrapin as surplus when they could and turn it into whatever they needed to because they loved the ship so much. And this got a good reputation with Anvil overall for their rugged dependability and their able to fill the role that was what it says on the tin. For that, let's go over to the other ships, the oldest, the most iconic, and the newest ships from Anvil in terms of their military applications. All right, here we are at the other hall, where for the newest and oldest. Well, I guess also the Valkyrie. Now let's talk about the iconic ship, the ship of Anvil, the thing that is most associated with the brand, the Hornet. Now, the Hornet is from the beginnings of the 29th century. Pull it up real quick. The Hornet was first developed in 2806. The Avenger, which was the ship that it was replacing, was getting long in the tooth and wasn't really filling out the roles it needed to fight the Vanduul. Good for Tevarin and Xi'an, but not so much for Vanduul. So they needed a ship that would be able to go toe-to-toe with Vanduul raiding parties. That was tough, reliable, armored, had lots of guns to knock through Anvil shielding and defenses as well. So, seeing as they enjoyed the Terrapin so much, they turned to Anvil to produce this ship. And that became the F7A Hornet. And this is the Mark II variant. The original version looks much more like this, which is the civilian version right now. Now, the F7A, I can't stress this enough, is the best fighter humanity has ever produced. There are more Hornets that have scored more kills in more conflicts than any other fighter in human history. In fact, one of the most famous quotes of the of the ship is from a Squadron 42 member named Aria Riley, famous ace, who said, "Give me a fully loaded Hornet and I can shake the gates of heaven." So the F-7A, right out the box, became an amazing favorite for the Navy, especially for Navy fighter pilots. And early on, civilians began to ask if they could get a civilian version of the Hornet. Remember that this is shortly after the Measure era, where very few civilians got access to military ships. And it wasn't normal for the military hardware to fall into the hands of civilians. But this is the new UEE, not the old UEE, especially as the new UEE wanted to cut down on its own costs of protecting the frontier. So the idea of giving militia and security forces access to practically a military-grade ship was a good idea for the Navy. They thought it was a great idea. So they let Anvil produce the F-7C, the civilian version of the F-7A. And it was as popular as the military version. Not quite as powerful, but still quite useful, which is what you're seeing here. During the 30th century, there was obviously some needed updates after almost a century of experience with the Mark I. So they went back to the design board and created the Mark II, along with the new versions of the F-7C and new variants of it, the Tracker, the Ghost, and the Super Hornet, as well as the Wildfire, which is a special edition. Now, this is the Mark II variant. It's slimmer, still has a lot of the tougher guns and such, but a little bit more maneuverable to take on lighter targets. Still the mainline fighter. It is the main medium fighter for the UEE today, specifically the Navy. Now, the Valkyrie is another interesting... Ooh, he's floating. And now he's gone. And now he's floating. And now he's gone. Star Citizen, ladies and gentlemen. The Valkyrie has its own unique history as well. The Valkyrie was first... Find the actual notes. First produced... Oh, it doesn't say this. But it was first produced in the early 29th century. Anvil had just produced the Hornet and the Terrapin, and they wanted to produce a new ship. They wanted to produce a ship that wasn't a dedicated combat ship, because they didn't want to get roped, kind of typecast, as it were, to just a military ship manufacturer. But they still wanted to produce something for the military, just something that would be not directly combat focused. So they ran some future projections. There was a supercomputer that they used that had a long wait line, years wait time, that you would feed information in, and as you fed that information in, it would pop out all of the information you needed that you were requested. So they asked this machine what the future Navy needed that they lacked currently at the time. What the computer and Anvil didn't know is that at the middle of the 28th century, during the Measure era, there was a secret study that had been performed to look at the successes of the Second Tavaran War, which had happened about 150 years before. The successes and failures to kind of like measure the effectiveness of it. And they found that the UEE lacked dedicated transports for troops and material to get to the front lines, because they're relying on old, basically converted civilian haulers, like the Hull C today, effectively, to move a lot of their stuff. And that cost a lot of lives. So that created the birth of Starlift Command, which would eventually lead to the creation of the M2 Hercules. But during that time, it was quickly forgotten about as the Measure era came to an end. But that study resurfaced in the beginning of the 30th or the 29th century. And when that study had resurfaced, their call came out for a ship to fill a role for troop transport. And Anvil not only responded, but they responded with a ship that had already built and tested called the Valkyrie, because they had built that ship during this, because their supercomputer had said the UEE needed transport ships to be able to take on the Vanduul and reclaim Vanduul space from Vanduul, reclaim it back for humanity. They didn't have drop ships or heavy cargo ships that could drop directly onto the front lines. So when the UEE came calling, Anvil already had the Valkyrie ready to go. So that's the Valkyrie, which is still used by the Marines and the Navy and the Army today extensively for combat operations all over the place. It's also used for civilians. Civilians use, especially surveyors, often use these quite effectively because it has great range and lots of capabilities to hold lots of people and cargo and gear. So they can use it to fly from point to point and drop off gears, drop off scientific equipment. So they're very flexible in terms of their usage in the verse. Then we're going to look at the oldest Anvil ship, period, and the newest, or probably the most sleekest, newest ship. So, during the Second Tavaran War, Anvil's predecessor, Case Aerospace, stepped to the front to help the UEE win the war. They were getting their butt kicked, and they needed some new technology to counter Tavaran technology and tactics. And the Leonard Case looked at what the Tavaran were using and put together a ship to essentially mirror match the Tavaran. One of the major ships was a two-person fighter called the Jackal, where the second seat operated the defenses, operated the shields to be able to direct the shields where they needed to be to prevent any sort of attacks directly against that ship from being very effective. It also helped cover other ships as it moved. So Case developed the ship with a secondary gunner seat rather than an engineering seat, and that gunner seat was designed to have as much firepower as possible to pour on to the enemy, overwhelming the resources while allowing the fighter pilot to maneuver out of harm's way. The mirror universe version of the Jackal, which became known as the Hurricane. It was very effective and very well loved, though it took some time to get used to because nothing had been designed like this. And as we said before, if you look at the design language, big central circle, point and wings, and a little back section. The origin of the Anvil design style. So, unfortunately, when Case died, the Anvil Hurricane stopped producing, and it kind of went off into oblivion. But during the Vandal War recently, the official declaration of war, the UEE needed more tougher ships. So J. Harris Arnold reintroduced the Hurricane, updated with modern specs, modern equipment, but using similar space frame, which became the Anvil Hurricane, which is what we see here. Now, the F-7A is a very good fighter, but it is still not quite exactly what you need to fight the Vandal. So, taking everything they learned from the Mark II program, Anvil produced the F-8. Now, there were 3 ships designed for the next generation fighter. That next generation fighter's competition had Aegis, RSI, and Anvil. Aegis produced a ship which was called the Dogfighter 3000. While there isn't direct connections, because of other references in lore, it's likely that the Dogfighter 3000 is actually the Saber. Then you have RSI, which produced a heavy fighter called the Black Widow. Again, no direct references, but it's likely that the Black Widow was actually the Scorpius, ship that's now released. And Anvil produced the F-8 Lightning, this ship right here. These ships were designed to replace the aging F-7, and obviously the F-8 won its contract. Though the Saber and the Scorpius are both still in military use as well. They still have their own kind of usage, even though they didn't win the competition. So all of these different ships are being used by the military. But the F-8 is slowly replacing the F-7 and even the Gladius as the mainline fighter, replacing a lot of these old squadrons with these brand new ships. And the most famous of these is the red painted 999th 10th Test Squadron, the Reckless 999th, who use red painted F-8s in flight demonstrations all the time. So that's the Lightning. Not available for civilians yet. There is a civilian version, the F-8C, which is yet to become out, though. Let's go look at the ground vehicles for Anvil here shortly. Alrighty, here we are in the ground vehicle section. This is the Anvil Ballista. We'll look at the Spartan as well, but these are both built on what's called the Anvil Atlas chassis. Now, in a world where you can fly with quantum-capable ships and thrusters that can beat 1 g of gravity easily, there isn't really much call for ground vehicles. And the only major ground vehicle manufacturer for the military was Tumbrel Land Systems, which was by the time of Anvil quite defunct. In fact, not even being purchased. The military is no longer using ground vehicles practically at all. So during the new UEE, when they needed to have some sort of flexible ground system that could be a anti-aircraft or a troop transport, they developed the Atlas chassis. The ballista was used quite extensively in the defense against the Vandul on the front lines, used by the Marines as well as other branches like the Army. And the Spartan is also still used as a troop transport, one of the best troop and VIP transports on the market today, even sold for civilians as well. Just like all other Anvil ships, vehicles, it was first sold as a for military, but then eventually got a civilian right alongside of it. So we probably will see more Anvil chassis as well, or Anvil Atlas chassis as well, because they recently kind of retconned that this is just a chassis system, so which means we may see a flatbed variant, or an artillery variant, or an infantry fighting variant. Who knows? Let's see. Now, with that, let's look at the future possibilities for Anvil. Stuff that's not quite in the game, but will be shortly, including the Crucible. Now, the Anvil Crucible is designed as a flying garage. If you look at here, these arms that are on the sides, these are actually multi-tools. They're tools with different arms inside of them that can collapse out and come back in to help repair and replace damaged parts for vehicles. And it has a little garage, which kind of shell that ships can land on, the smaller ships can land on and get repaired. But that garage can be dumped, and the arms can be extended out to form a lattice work around, with other crucibles around capital ships, to kind of create its own floating dry dock to cut out large sections of armor and replacement and all sorts of things. So this is used extensively by the military for repair operations. It's also used quite frequently by civilians as well. Again, if you want a flying garage, it's a Crucible. Next is the latest offering from Anvil. We don't know a lot about this, but this is the Legionnaire. The Anvil Legionnaire is designed as a boarding ship. It has two front cockpit operators. One's a pilot and one is a hacker. An infiltrator specialist, I guess. And it also has seats for 8 boarding crew, with its front section having a locker for demolition charges as well as weapons and armor. The goal of this ship is to be small, get up to a disabled vessel, dock, forcibly breach any docking areas, docking collars, and then take the ship. So, and it's being, again, small enough to be put on most carriers as well. It's probably not very long range in its application. And last but not least, we have the Liberator. Now, it's not exactly clear, but the Liberator is actually not a military ship. This seems to be Anvil's first ever ground-up civilian vessel, built to help ferry ships and vehicles all over the verse. Short-range light carrier is what it's called. And it's kind of used as possibly a dropship in some roles, but it's mostly designed for short-range missions to carry large ships or small ships or vehicles from point A to point B, with a small number of crew. It only has about 3 members of crew. So if you need to go to places like, say, Pyro, where you need to transport goods or ships that need to be able to operate, then a Liberator is a good option. And that is the Anvil day here, Anvil floor here at Invictus 2952. Let me know what you think. Which ship is your favorite? Are you going to purchase any of these ships on sale? Let me know in the comments below. And as I always say, hope to see you someday in the black. And remember, ex Historia ad Astra.